When I was a child, I experienced something that no child should ever go through. My family abandoned me at a gas station, a place meant for short pauses and refueling, not for leaving behind blood and flesh. I remember the details so vividly, as if etched into my memory with fire. The air smelled of gasoline and fried snacks from the small shop nearby. Cars passed, engines roaring, strangers coming and going, none of them noticing the little figure standing alone, waiting for someone who would never come back. The sun was setting that evening, bleeding into the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I looked around, searching for the familiar faces of the people I trusted most, but all I saw was the fading trace of the vehicle that had carried my family away. At first, I didn't believe it. I told myself they must have gone inside the shop, maybe to buy something for the road, maybe to use the restroom. I convinced myself they would be back in a moment. I clutched the straps of my small backpack tighter, waiting. Minutes turned into hours, and the realization began to sink in like poison spreading through my veins. The car was gone. The voices I longed to hear never returned. And in that cold moment of clarity, I knew what had happened. I wasn't lost. I wasn't forgotten. I was left. Children often cry when they are lost, reaching out for comfort, desperate for love, but I didn't cry. Not a single tear slipped down my face. I stood there frozen, my small hands clenched into fists, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. It wasn't sadness that filled me, it was betrayal. It was confusion twisting into something darker. I thought of all the times I had smiled at them, all the times I had tried to be good, all the times I thought family meant forever. But to them, I was disposable. To them, I was a burden that could be tossed aside without hesitation. I replayed in my mind every small detail that might have led them to this. Did I talk too much? Did I ask for too many things? Was I not enough for them? These questions consumed me in those first hours. Each one stabbed deeper than the last, but even as the wounds grew, something else began to form beneath the pain. A seed planted itself in the soil of my heart, watered not by tears, but by silence and fire. I realized in that moment that if no one else would protect me, I would protect myself. If no one else would care for me, I would care for myself. And if no one else saw my worth, then one day I would force them to. The gas station lights flickered on as the night deepened. I could hear the hum of insects, the sound of tires screeching on asphalt, the chatter of strangers passing by. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone waiting for them. Everyone but me. I became invisible in that crowd, just a child blending into the background, ignored, overlooked, dismissed. And yet, in that invisibility, I found a strange kind of strength. Nobody expected anything from me, nobody saw what I was becoming inside. That made me dangerous. That made me free. The abandonment didn't just scar me, it shaped me. Every second that passed without them was a lesson carved into my soul. I learned that love could be an illusion, that trust could be shattered without warning, that even those who share your blood can turn their backs without guilt. But I also learned something else: pain can be fuel. Betrayal can be a teacher. Loneliness can be a forge where steel is created. I was a child standing on broken ground, but I was also something else, something they had unknowingly created, a survivor. I can still hear the low hum of that gas station sign buzzing in the dark, casting pale light over my small figure. I remember the cold bench where I sat, legs dangling, waiting for a miracle that never came. I remember the taste of the cheap candy I bought with the few coins I had, my only comfort as the hours dragged on. I remember the looks of strangers, some curious, some pitying, but none stopping long enough to ask the question that mattered. Why was a child all alone at night in a place like this? And yet, I didn't ask for help. I didn't call out. I kept silent, holding the storm inside me, holding the vow that had just begun to form. That gas station became my crucible. It was where my innocence cracked, where my childhood ended, where the foundation of who I would become was laid. I was no longer simply a child abandoned. I was a soul awakened to the harsh truth of the world. The betrayal was brutal, but it was also the spark that lit a fire no one could extinguish. It wasn't weakness that defined me from that day forward. It was resolve, forged in the heart of abandonment, sharpened by the silence of those who should have stood by me. I stood there, a child left behind, but instead of letting my emotions break me apart, I chose something different. I chose not to cry, not to scream, not to beg anyone to notice me. Crying would have been easy, tears would have fallen naturally, but I refused to give them that satisfaction even if they couldn't see me anymore. I didn't want to be the child remembered as weak, the one who broke down at the first taste of betrayal. Inside me, there was a sudden, unexplainable strength that refused to let me collapse. My chest felt heavy, my throat tight, but I clenched my jaw and swallowed it all. I told myself if they could walk away without a second glance, then I could stand without falling apart. Every instinct in my body told me to cry, to search for comfort, to run after the car that had carried them away. But I resisted those instincts. Instead, I forced myself to breathe slowly, to hold my ground, to face the silence that pressed in from all directions. It was as if I had split in two in that moment. One part of me was still the abandoned child, small and vulnerable, but the other part was already evolving into something harder, something unshakable. That second part began whispering to me, "Don't show weakness, don't give in, don't let them define what you become." I watched families stop for fuel, watched children laughing in the back seats of their parents' cars, watched strangers hugging one another before they parted ways. Each sight was a reminder of what I didn't have, but instead of letting jealousy and sadness consume me, I focused on holding myself together. I folded my arms tight across my chest, sat with my back straight on that cold bench outside the small shop, and stared at the ground as if daring the earth itself to challenge me. My silence became my shield. My dry eyes became my weapon. People glanced at me, some even slowed down, but when they saw no tears, no visible signs of distress, they moved on. And strangely, I preferred it that way. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want their questions. I didn't want to explain that my own blood had walked away and left me there. If I had been crying, if I had looked broken, maybe someone would have asked, maybe someone would have tried to help, but they didn't because I looked calm. And that calmness became the first step in proving to myself that I didn't need anyone to save me. Inside, though, it wasn't calm. It was fire. It was rage bubbling beneath the surface, mixing with the cold sting of abandonment. I could feel my small hands shaking, my fingernails digging into my palms until they left red marks, but I held everything in. That choice, that decision not to let the tears fall, was my rebellion against the people who thought I would crumble. They wanted me gone, forgotten, erased, but in refusing to break down, I was already proving them wrong. The night grew colder and hunger gnawed at my stomach. A child would normally cry in that moment, desperate for food, desperate for comfort, but I stayed quiet, swallowing the ache like it was nothing. My silence wasn't emptiness, it was resistance. Each second I held back my tears was a silent declaration. I am not weak. I am not broken. I am not what you believe me to be. I wanted to scream those words, but I knew the true power wasn't in screaming, it was in enduring. I thought about the faces of my family as they drove away, imagined them laughing, or maybe not even thinking of me at all. That thought could have crushed me, but instead, it fueled me. If they expected me to collapse, then I would not. If they wanted me to beg, I would never. That stubborn fire inside me hardened with every passing minute. The longer I stayed strong, the stronger I became. It was like building walls around my heart, layer after layer, until nothing could break through. The sound of cars passing became like background noise, the chatter of strangers faded into nothing, and I sat there as if I was no longer a child, but a figure carved from stone. My eyes stayed dry, my breathing steady, my heart loud but contained. I discovered that in silence, there is power. In withholding tears, there is control. And in control, there is survival. Choosing strength over tears did not mean I wasn't hurting. It meant I was transforming the hurt into something else, something I didn't even fully understand yet. It meant refusing to let pain dictate my actions. It meant refusing to give my family, even from afar, the victory of knowing they had broken me. My silence was not emptiness, it was defiance. It was the moment I began building the version of myself that would never again allow anyone to see me as disposable. In that moment of abandonment, when the silence of the gas station wrapped around me like a cruel blanket, I made a vow that would shape everything that followed. It wasn't spoken aloud, not written anywhere, but it burned itself into my mind with a clarity sharper than any knife. I promised myself that I would never forget. I promised myself that the faces of those who left me behind would be etched forever into my memory, not as family, but as a reminder of betrayal. That vow wasn't about sadness, it wasn't about yearning for them to return, it was about revenge, the kind of revenge that comes not from a single act, but from a life lived with unshakable determination. The vow began as a whisper inside me, a thought that wrapped itself around the anger in my chest. They thought I would cry. They thought I would shrink into nothing, a lost child that no one would ever remember. But I swore to myself I would not be forgotten. I would not vanish. I would rise, and one day, they would see me again, not as the helpless child they abandoned, but as the storm that their betrayal had created. I sat on that cold bench, legs dangling, fists clenched, staring at the flickering light of the gas station sign above me. My vow gave me warmth when the night air grew colder. It gave me strength when hunger twisted my stomach into knots. It gave me purpose when my mind threatened to spiral into despair. That silent promise became my anchor. It wasn't enough to survive the night. I needed to survive long enough to become something they could never ignore. The vow was simple but powerful. I would never let them win. Every act of theirs was meant to erase me, but every breath I took was proof that they had failed. I swore I would take every ounce of pain they had given me and turn it into strength. I swore I would use the loneliness, the hunger, the emptiness as fuel. And one day, when I had built myself into someone they could never have imagined, I would return. They would look at me, and instead of the fragile child they abandoned, they would see the consequence of their cruelty staring back at them. Even as a child, I felt the weight of that vow settling into my bones. It was heavy, but it didn't crush me, it forged me. I repeated it in my head like a mantra. I will not break, I will not cry, I will not be forgotten. Every time my throat tightened and tears threatened, I whispered it again inside my mind, forcing the tears back, replacing them with fire. Every second I endured became part of that vow. Every breath I took became proof that I was stronger than what they wanted me to be. When strangers passed me by, when their eyes lingered for a moment before they looked away, I wondered if they could feel it too. I wondered if they could sense that the small, quiet child sitting alone was not simply abandoned, but already making a promise to the world. I wanted them to see it in my eyes, the unspoken defiance, the vow that was growing stronger with each passing hour. My silence was not weakness. My stillness was not defeat. It was the beginning of something greater, something they had unknowingly unleashed. I thought of my family's faces, the ones who should have protected me, the ones who had turned their backs. In my mind, I held their image, not with longing, but with fire. I swore to never let that image soften. I swore to never rewrite the memory into something less painful. I wanted to remember the sting of their betrayal forever, because forgetting would mean forgiving, and forgiving was not an option. The vow demanded remembrance, and remembrance demanded strength. As the hours passed, as the gas station grew quieter and the night stretched deeper, the vow became less of a thought and more of a living thing inside me. It pulsed with every beat of my heart. It coursed through me with every breath I took. I began to realize that this vow was not just about revenge, it was about survival, about refusing to let them define me as broken. If they had left me behind to erase me, then my very existence, my survival, was already my first act of vengeance. My vow was not about running after them or begging them to take me back. It was about becoming untouchable, unshakable, undeniable. It was about making sure that the next time they saw me, they would feel the weight of what they had done, the weight of the person I had become because of their choice. It was about ensuring that their betrayal would haunt them, not me. They had abandoned a child, but they had also created something far greater than themselves. The vow echoed inside me as the night dragged on, stronger than hunger, stronger than fear. It was the reason I sat with my back straight, my fists clenched, my face dry. It was the reason I stared at the horizon, imagining a future where I would no longer be the one left behind. It was the reason I refused to collapse when everything in me wanted to curl up and disappear. That vow was not just words, it was transformation. Abandonment taught me lessons that no classroom ever could, and out of that cruel lesson I began to build something that would not be easily broken: resilience. It started small, almost invisible, like hairline cracks in stone that eventually become canyons. At first, the resilience was practical, learning to wrap my own wounds, to find shade when the sun felt too hot, to eat when no one offered food, but it quickly grew into something deeper. A structure of mind and habit that kept me upright when the world tried to knock me down. I learned to read the signs around me, which strangers were safe enough to ask a question, which places offered shelter after dark, which sounds meant danger, and which meant help. Those skills were born from necessity, but necessity became discipline, and discipline cultivated a steadiness in my hands and a calmness in my voice that fooled people into thinking I had always been this way. Resilience, I discovered, is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move with fear at your side. Every night after the gas station, when shadows lengthened and memories pressed like weights against my ribs, I practiced small acts of courage. I walked farther than I was comfortable walking. I waited longer before seeking assistance. I refused the instant relief of a familiar voice telling me it would be okay if that voice belonged to someone who had abandoned me before. Those tiny refusals stacked like bricks. Each refusal made me less dependent and more self-reliant until my independence felt less like loneliness and more like armor. I learned to convert the language of pain into tactical advantage. Where the world expected me to buckle, I learned to observe. Where they expected me to flinch at the first sign of disappointment, I began to catalog details: the cadence of lies, the quickness of footsteps leaving a room, the way promises fray at the seams. That catalog became a map of other people's weaknesses and a set of instructions on how not to be undone by them. Instead of letting grief scatter me, I trained it into focus. Grief sharpened my perception. Betrayal taught me to test loyalty. Hunger refined patience. Each brutal lesson carved away naivety and left behind a clearer, harder core. Resilience also demanded creativity. When resources were scarce, I learned to improvise. A torn shirt became insulation. A discarded paper cup became a container. A stray dog's watchfulness taught me how to sense danger before it arrived. Adaptation became a game of seeming small while thinking big. I practiced looking like someone unremarkable so people wouldn't notice the way my mind raced with contingency plans. If the world assumed I was fragile, that belief worked in my favor because it lowered other people's guard. I used that misperception like a tool, quiet on the outside, meticulous on the inside, building a life that could sustain itself without the safety nets my family had shredded. There were social lessons too. I learned to be strategic with trust. The old me might have given my heart away to the first person who offered kindness. The new me measured kindness against past behavior. That didn't mean I became cold or incapable of love. It meant I became deliberate. I offered pieces of myself on a schedule, not in a burst, and I observed how others treated those pieces. People who stayed consistent earned more. Those who were erratic earned distance. In this way, resilience steered my relationships toward reciprocity and away from exploitation. It protected my energy so I could channel it where it mattered, toward growth, toward work, toward the slow accumulation of means that would one day allow me to rewrite the ledger of what I deserved. The physical body learned resilience too. I became conscious of my sleep cycles, of the foods that made my mind clear versus foggy, of the exercise that turned simmering anger into useful endurance instead of a volatile outburst. I taught myself to rest in a way that wasn't surrender but preparation. Rest became a strategic pause, a way to gather strength for the inevitable challenges. Small routines, waking at the same hour, keeping my living space orderly, learning to cook simple meals, were not domestic comforts as much as they were training regimens. They proved that stability could be manufactured even when history insisted chaos was my inheritance. Emotionally, resilience was a practice of redefinition. I refused the labels handed to me: abandoned, worthless, disposable. Instead, I adopted vocabularies of agency: survivor, architect, witness. Language matters because it shapes the contours of thought. By choosing words that described action and potential, I rewired how I understood my possibilities. I also allowed myself small mercies, a laugh that came freely when something genuinely funny happened, a moment of soft nostalgia for a memory that wasn't poisoned by betrayal. These were not compromises, they were recalibrations. Resilience, I learned, is not an absence of tenderness, but a way to keep tenderness from becoming an Achilles heel. Another layer of resilience was learning the long game. Revenge stories often glamorize sudden payback, but the kind of endurance born in me needed time. I invested in education, in disparate jobs that taught me new skills, in relationships that broadened my perspective. I saved, not because I wanted to hoard, but because security has its own quiet power. When you are financially stable, you can choose your battles. When you are skilled, you can walk into rooms with authority. Building resilience meant accumulating these quiet advantages so that when I finally confronted those who had abandoned me, I would not be a child with a grudge, but an adult with resources, options, and the moral clarity that comes from having earned every inch of ground. Resilience forged a moral paradox. I remained unforgiving in memory, but generous in method. I refused to let my past justify cruelty, and yet I used the memory of betrayal as an engine to propel me forward. The people who hurt me became less important than the life I was assembling brick by prudent brick. I took pride not in spectacular payback, but in the slow, relentless construction of a future where I would no longer be defined by that single night at the gas station. Each small success, a stable job, a friend who proved steady, a room that felt safely mine, served as evidence that resilience was not merely survival but transformation. A remaking that ensured the child who had been left would never again be so easily discarded, and that when I finally returned, I was not the same person they had left behind. Time had carved me into something sharper, something unrecognizable to those who once thought I would remain small and powerless. The child they had abandoned at a gas station had grown into someone whose silence carried weight, whose eyes no longer begged for love, but demanded acknowledgement. I walked into their presence not as a fragile memory of the past, but as a living embodiment of consequences. They had imagined me erased, forgotten, dissolved into the cracks of the world, but instead I stood before them as proof that betrayal does not destroy, it transforms. Every step I took back toward them was deliberate, a rehearsal of control. My voice no longer wavered, my hands no longer trembled. They looked at me and tried to find traces of the child they had discarded, but what stared back at them was something far removed from innocence. My face carried the shadow of survival, my posture carried the certainty of someone who had endured storms they could never imagine. I saw confusion in their eyes, maybe even a flicker of guilt, but mostly I saw fear, the kind of fear born from realizing that the person you tried to erase has come back stronger than you. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to remind them of what they had done. My presence alone was a reminder. Every word I spoke carried the weight of the vow I had made that night, every sentence wrapped in the strength I had built from their absence. I didn't ask them why. I didn't plead for explanations. I stood there as the unspoken answer to their cruelty. They had left me to vanish, and yet here I was, undeniable, unshakable, and transformed into the very thing they never wanted to face. They searched my expression, waiting to see if I carried forgiveness, but forgiveness was not what I had come for. I hadn't grown into this version of myself to offer them comfort. I hadn't endured hunger, loneliness, and the weight of betrayal just to soothe their conscience. I had come to show them that every wound they had inflicted had been turned into armor, that every scar was not weakness, but proof of survival. My very being was a mirror reflecting back the cost of their decision, and in that reflection, they saw themselves more clearly than they ever wanted to. I could see the shift in them as they realized the truth. I no longer needed them. The power they once held over me had dissolved. I had learned to live without their love, without their presence, without their protection. My independence was a fortress, my willpower an unshakable wall, and no amount of words could penetrate it. They had made me an orphan long before the world would have, and in doing so, they had also made me untouchable. I had taken their abandonment and crafted from it a weapon they could never disarm. Returning stronger was not about wealth or status, though I had carved out both through persistence and endurance. It was about standing in front of them as living evidence that I was not broken. It was about letting them see that the very act meant to erase me had instead defined me. They wanted me forgotten, but I had become unforgettable. They wanted me small, but I had grown larger than their narrow vision could contain. They wanted me voiceless, but I had built a voice that carried further than theirs ever could. As they looked at me, silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. It was the same silence I had carried with me at the gas station, but this time it belonged to them. They were the ones who couldn't find words, the ones trapped in the gravity of what they had done. And I stood still, letting them drown in it. I didn't need to relive the night in words. I let them relive it in my presence. My existence was enough. My strength was enough. My survival was enough. There was no anger in my voice when I finally spoke, because anger would have given them power again. Instead, there was calm certainty, the kind that slices deeper than rage. I spoke not as the child they left, but as the storm their betrayal had forged. They listened because they had no choice, and I knew that every syllable reminded them that I was no longer theirs to hurt. The child who might have cried for them was gone forever. The person standing before them was a creation entirely of my own making, sculpted from pain, sharpened by time, and fortified by the vow that had carried me through every moment of silence. Their faces told me everything I needed to know. They wanted to deny it, to pretend the past hadn't happened, but denial collapsed under the weight of what I had become. They couldn't erase me anymore. They couldn't dismiss me. They couldn't reduce me to nothing. I had returned not to seek love, but to deliver the truth they had spent years avoiding. They had abandoned a child, but standing before them was not a child anymore. It was the living consequence of their choice, the unshakable evidence that betrayal always creates something stronger than itself. Consequences are not always loud, but they are always certain. When my family saw me again, they were forced to face the weight of what they had done. Every choice they made, every mile they drove away from that gas station, every laugh they shared without me, it all came crashing back onto them the moment they realized I had not disappeared. I stood before them, not seeking reconciliation, not searching for explanations, but existing as the consequence they could not escape. Their abandonment had not erased me, it had carved me into something they could not control. I didn't need to raise my voice or recount every wound. The silence between us was heavier than any speech I could have given. They saw in my eyes that I had remembered everything, that I had carried the memory of that night like a blade sharpened with time. They saw that I no longer needed them, that I had built a life on the very foundation of their absence. That realization alone was punishment. It stripped away the illusion of power they once held, leaving them exposed to the truth that their actions had consequences they never considered. Each glance they gave me was a silent confession. They searched for forgiveness, for softness in my expression, but found none. What they faced instead was the undeniable strength of someone who had survived without them. My independence, my resolve, my presence, all of it was proof that they had failed to destroy me. They had tried to make me invisible, and yet I stood unshakable, forcing them to confront the version of me they had created. Their guilt became visible in the way their voices faltered, in the way they avoided my gaze. They wanted to forget, but I was unforgettable. They wanted to dismiss me, but I was undeniable. They wanted me erased, but here I was, the living embodiment of their betrayal. Every breath I took in front of them was a reminder that choices cannot be undone, that betrayal leaves scars not only on the betrayed, but on the betrayers as well. In that moment, they were no longer in control. The power had shifted entirely. The consequence of abandonment was staring back at them, and it carried a weight heavier than any words could deliver.